Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you back for another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, this is my weekly podcast where I discuss a book, have an author interview, and then something I'm looking at. And this week, we are proud to be bringing you an episode with Scott Eyman. Scott Eyman is a wonderful, wonderful biographer, and he's written a new book coming out called Charlie Chaplin versus America. Now, Scott has written about a host of golden age of Hollywood actors and actresses, and this is just another one of his books. I mean, I've got the John Wayne book, I got the Cary Grant book, I got books on Jimmy Stewart and Henry Fonda, you name it. He did books with Robert Wagner. I got them all. Okay, I love Scott Eyman. You're going to enjoy his book. Just coming out on the 31st of October, and this is all about Charlie Chaplin and what happened to Charlie Chaplin later in his career. He talks somewhat to the early parts, obviously, but a lot of this is focused on what happened later once the great dictator comes out. And Scott tells us all about his trials, his tribulations, troubles with the law, troubles with, the people like Hedda Hopper, Ed Sullivan, the columnists who were so influential but who didn't like Charlie Chaplin. Talks about how he left America and what happened when he got on that boat to go to England back in the 50s. He tells us about his wife, Oona, who was the daughter of the great playwright Eugene O'Neill. And as a playwright, O'Neill's considered one of the greats. As a father and a parent, he's one of the jerks of this world. So we're going to hear all about that also. We're going to hear all about his, like I said, his life and the times, and it's a wonderful, wonderful biography. So, without any further ado, let's go right to our interview with Scott Eyman. Welcome to Books and Looks, Scott.
Thanks, Blaine. It's good to be here.
Well, you have had a wonderful career as an author of books about some of the greats of Hollywood. What got you interested in that type of writing and in that whole genre of books?
Well, I basically write about movies of the past. For whatever reason, I'm not really attracted to movies of the future. I see them, I watch them, but it's not something I have any particular interest in writing about. I came of age in the 60s, and that's when I started going to movies. And one of my seminal experiences was a movie called Harold Lloyd's World of Comedy, a compilation film that Harold Lloyd put together in 1963, I believe it was, 62 or 63. And I saw it. It was funny, because Harold Lloyd's funny. But that wasn't actually what attracted me. What attracted me was the otherness of it, the clothes of the 1920s, the cars of the 1920s, the different faces of the 1920s, because the gene pool had shifted in 40 or 50 years, when I started to watch movies of the 20s.
Right.
That just got me interested in pursuing this other culture and this other life and this other civilization that had preceded mine. That's a neat way of putting it. It took me years to put all this together as to why I write the books I write and why I'm interested in the things I'm interested in. But that's essentially it. That's the Reader's Digest version of why I do what I do. It was a documentary impulse that I saw beyond the jokes and the humor in the Harold Lloyd films. I saw a whole different way of life, and I think basically that's what I've been trying to document all these years, a different way of life and a different way of making movies.
Well, you're one of the leaders in this genre with regard to these biographies, and you have covered so many, many stars. And as I tell everybody, if you watch Turner Classic Movies, he's written a book about them. I mean, you A to Z, you got them all, it seems like. So by the 70s, you said you became a real big movie buff. You started going to see all the movies?
Yeah, double features, drive-ins, you name it.
Right. We're talking today about Chaplin, but could you just tell the folks out there titles of some of the other stars that you've written about?
Oh, John Wayne, Cary Grant, Mary Pickford, Ernst Lubitsch. I've done a few books on directors, Ernst Lubitsch and John Ford. And then I kind of moved over to stars, actors, because they are the reason people go to see the movies more than directors. Directors are the ones who make the movie work or are not able to make the movie work, but people pay to see stars. So my interest shifted somewhat. But yeah, I've written, I think Chaplin is my 17th book, but I've been at it a long time.
Yeah. Wow. Absolutely. That's amazing. Now, when you start researching these books, how long does it take you to research a book about a movie star, someone in the movie business?
Well, the longest I've taken was 6 years to write a book. That was the John Ford. The Louis B. Mayer book took me 5. Generally, they take me 3 to 4. The 6-year thing, even I thought the 6 years was, maybe I was carrying this a bit too far. But that's what it took. That's what it took. And the Mayer book was complicated because I made a mistake I haven't made since. I overwrote. I wrote basically a 2-volume book. And when I looked at it, when I was through with it, I read it and I realized that nobody wanted 2 volumes on Louis B. Mayer. Even I didn't want 2 volumes on Louis B. Mayer. So I spent a year cutting it to 1 volume, and cutting a book of that size, a 1,300 or 1,400 page book, cutting a book that size is very complicated because as you're cutting it, you have to fill in the holes to make transitions between the material that you're keeping. So it was very structurally complicated, and I had nobody to blame but myself. And that was a mistake I've never made since.
Now, as I say, we talk about these old black and white stars, the golden era of Hollywood. It's getting harder and harder to do research on these people, isn't it?
Oh, sure. Because the actuarial tables kicked in a long time ago. And if you're talking about the studio system of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, it basically began to die out in the 60s. There are very few people with feet on the ground anymore. So the research process is far more archival and library-oriented than it was when I started out 30-odd years ago.
Luckily, there's the internet.
Well, I don't actually do that much on the internet. The internet isn't terribly helpful to me because I'm looking for stuff that hasn't been accessed. And if it's on the internet, it's accessed. Anybody can access it. So there's no reason anybody should pay $25 or $30 for a book if they can read the information that you're processing, if they can read it on the internet. So I have to go above and beyond what's immediately accessible on the internet. So that actually is the fun part. That I enjoy because you still have your eureka moments when you come across something that you weren't sure existed, but here it is right in front of you.
What attracted you to write this book now about Charlie Chaplin?
Well, I'd always loved him. He was actually, along with Harold Lloyd, my entry drug into silent films when I was 12 or so, 10 or 12. But there are dozens and dozens of books on Charlie Chaplin. I know. I've read them all. So the problem is, what do you write about? Writing about Charlie Chaplin is like writing about Winston Churchill. Every couple of years, there's a book on Churchill. Winston Churchill's painting, Winston Churchill's drinking, Winston Churchill fighting the Nazis by himself, whatever. There's a constant procession of books on Winston Churchill. Chaplin's not that bad. The publications aren't that frequent, but there are a lot of books on Charlie Chaplin. So the creative problem becomes, what aspect are you going to write about that hasn't been covered? And it seemed to me that the one aspect that got sloughed over, even in very good books, was the decade-long period of character assassination in which he was basically rendered persona non grata and ultimately kicked out of the country by the Attorney General of the United States in 1952. And I basically decided to zero in on that. So the book begins with a brief prologue to get him up to speed of 30 or 40 pages, because I can't assume that people know about Charlie Chaplin's backstory. And it ends with the same thing, 30 or 40 page section. But in between, it's almost entirely new, previously undiscovered material.
It was marvelous how you set this whole book up, and the fact that Chaplin is going to go over and promote a movie, and once he leaves the U.S., they tell him you can't come back. I never heard of that, Scott. I never knew that story.
Well, Chaplin was not a citizen, which was a real problem for the right wing of the blacklist era. He was a resident alien, technically, and whenever a resident alien in that era left, they had to apply for a reentry permit, and he applied for a reentry permit because he was going to be gone for a few months, because he was taking his wife and 4 kids with him to Europe, because after the film opened in London, he was going to take them on a vacation through Europe, because he hadn't left the country. He hadn't been out of America for 21 years. Last time he was out of the country was 1931-32. So he was due for a vacation, and he took his wife, Oona, and 4 kids with him. So they were all on the boat when he got the cable that his reentry permit had been revoked by the Attorney General. So he was stranded psychologically, stranded emotionally, and it was the beginning of a very chaotic period in his life. And he was not a man who wanted chaos. His entire childhood and adolescence had been structured around utter chaos, or rather not structured around utter chaos. It was a catch-as-catch-can period, and his life in Hollywood had been very structured because That's what he needed after his childhood. He didn't want to improvise on a daily basis. So he had a very ordered, almost bourgeois life in Hollywood with some breaks for chaos. But when the reentry permit was revoked, suddenly, because his entire life was centered in California, his money was in California, his studio was in California, his house, of course, his film library was in California. Basically, everything he owned was in California. So it wasn't much of a stretch for him to imagine that he could easily become a real-life representation of the tramp, stateless and impoverished and drifting from country to country, from place to place. It was a complete 52 pickup period in his life, and that was not something he ever wanted or aspired to have again.
Then you do a great job by taking us back to, just for a little bit, to his beginning, his childhood, and coming over. And one of the things that people don't realize is how generous Charlie Chaplin was. And one of his first leading ladies, Oona O'Neill. Tell us a little about who she was and how he was so charitable to this woman.
She became his leading lady when she was 18. She had just graduated from high school. He was working outside of San Francisco in Niles at that point for the S&A company, and he was looking for a new leading lady. And somehow or another, he saw her and decided to hire her, even though she had zero acting experience, which actually worked to his advantage. His method of directing was basically to ask the performer to imitate his performance of their part as closely as possible. He would act it out for them, and they were expected to mimic him. That was his way of working, especially with an inexperienced actor. So, as it turned out, she photographed beautifully. She had high spirits. She was utterly charming on screen, and they became lovers. And the affair lasted some years. After a while, they grew apart. He began working with her in 1915. They stopped working together in 1923, so it was 8 years where they were partnered. And after that, he kept her on payroll for the rest of her life. He cared for her. She made one movie away from him in France that is lost now, so we can't see how it was. He produced a picture for her in California, directed by Joseph von Sternberg, of all people, but he didn't like it and burned it. So we can't see Sternberg directing Oona O'Neill, which is a loss, I'm sure. And he kept her on payroll for the rest of her life, and she died in 1958, I believe. So it was a long time, but he felt he owed her and took care of her.
And she's not the only one. He had a great deal of attachment to so many people who worked with him, and he stayed with them throughout his career, even if they no longer were working with him.
Well, because his childhood was so chaotic and catch as catch can, and there was a period where he lived on the streets. His mother was in an insane asylum for years. His father died of alcoholism. It was really a traumatic childhood. So he wanted permanence. He wanted as solid a foundation around him as possible. So when he found people that he could work with, he kept them on forever. And he was very loyal. He did not pay huge salaries, it must be admitted. But he did pay salaries, and the check showed up every week. And even after he was kicked out of the country, he kept people on payroll. And when he finally closed the studio down, he gave very generous severances to people that had been with him for 30 and 40 years. And the fact that he had employees for the same employees for 30 or 40 years shows how loyal he was.
Yeah. Even when he was taking many years between films, he was going a mile a minute back in his heyday, but then things start to slow down a little bit, and he still kept people going, and it was wonderful. Well, one of the people, and you talk about bringing order, chaos, was his brother. His brother was an interesting character because his brother was supposedly maybe the joke guy, but he wasn't always there, but he also brought order to Charlie's life. And tell us a little bit about his brother.
His brother's name was Sidney, and Sidney is, I think, the unexplored hero of Charlie's life. He's 2 years older. Sidney was 2 years older than Charlie. They had different fathers, or at least we think they did, but nobody's quite sure. They looked a lot alike. They had a strong family resemblance. They have the same height, same coloring, same dark hair, etc. So it's possible they did have the same father. We're never going to know because Sidney had no kids. So you can't do any genealogical testing about DNA. But Sidney was always there for his brother, and he hovered over his brother. Sidney spent most of his time after 1927, 28 in the south of France. Sidney retired early and got out of show business and lived in Nice, around Nice. And he wrote a steady stream of letters to Charlie about all sorts of things. about the politics in France, about the coming war, about movie business. He gave Charlie endless criticisms about Charlie's films. He didn't hesitate to criticize Charlie's films if he didn't like them. There's a wonderful 7 or 8 single-spaced letter he wrote to Charlie criticizing Modern Times, which is posterity's favorite Charlie Chaplin movie. But Sidney was not crazy about it. And he wrote Charlie 7 or 8 single-spaced pages of criticism about it, which I quoted extensively because it's interesting, because in one sense, he makes some valid criticisms. In other ways, he's completely off base. But Sidney was always there for Charlie. Charlie was not always there for Sidney because Sidney was very attentive and wrote letters constantly because he liked to write letters. Charlie hated to write letters. There aren't a lot of Charlie Chaplin letters. He was very shy about writing because he was a bad speller. So to get a letter out of Charlie Chaplin, you had to blast for it. But there are some letters from Chaplin that I quote in the book. And the dynamic is essentially Sidney is always there for Charlie. Charlie is occasionally there for Sidney. And Sidney almost always ends his letter basically with a plea for some attention. Write me back.
Right. Let
me hear from you. You know, he says, I've sent you 3 letters and I haven't gotten a reply. Please let me hear from you. That kind of thing. Because Charlie was a lousy correspondent. That was just the way he was. And that never changed.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, Charlie was also a busy guy. Like I said, he was busy doing a lot of films, a lot of work. And anyway, we get to the crux of the book. As you say, Charlie Chaplin versus America, when art, sex, and politics collided. And what happened to bring this to the forefront? Why did the predecessor of the FBI now start investigating Charlie Chaplin?
They opened a file on him in 1923 because Will Hayes had been appointed the czar of the movies in response to a bunch of scandals that had happened in Hollywood, so they felt they had to clean up their act, or at least appear to clean up their act. And Chaplin thought the idea was absurd because he thought people were perfectly capable of policing themselves. The industry policed themselves. He didn't see why they had to hire a political guy from Washington other than for public relations purposes, which is essentially why Will Hayes was hired, for public relations. So he was publicly and privately dismissive of the idea of Will Hayes. And Will Hayes was highly connected in Washington because he'd been in the Harding administration. Not that that was a real credential I would think that you'd want to boast about, but he had been in the Harding administration. So the guy who was heading what became the FBI, it wasn't called the FBI in 1923, opened a file on him, probably at Hayes' request, and wrote some reports to Hayes about Chaplin's attitude towards Hayes and his attitude towards politics, which Burns, who was the head of the predecessor of the FBI, thought were indicative of socialism at the very least and communism at the very worst. And Hayes thought it was a little peculiar too. But then it died out. Then they basically moved on to other more pressing matters, and nothing happened really until before World War II, with Chaplin making The Great Dictator, which was prematurely anti-fascist, shall we say. He starts shooting the film in September of 1939, and the public and Congress are both isolationist, heavily isolationist. Hitler and the Jews were not our problem. Hitler and the Jews were Europe's problem. And Chaplin felt that Hitler was a mortal threat, basically, to Western civilization, and was determined to make this movie, a satire of Hitler. Nobody wanted the movie made. The British Foreign Office didn't want it made because Neville Chamberlain was the prime minister, and Neville Chamberlain was engaged in trying to pacify Hitler. And it didn't work, of course. And Chaplin starts making the film in September of 1939. It comes out in October of 1940. It's a huge hit. And people like Hedda Hopper and Westbrook Pegler and Ed Sullivan had all been predicting that the film would be a flop, that Chaplin was leaning way over his boots, that the market wasn't there, that people weren't interested in a satire of Hitler, that Americans weren't interested in a satire of Hitler, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the fact of the matter is that, of course, Europe, the European market was locked off at that point because Italy was fascist. France had turned fascist while the film was being made. Germany, of course, Belgium. The only European country that the film could be shown was England. So Chaplin had lost, 40% of the market, 40 or 50% of the world market was locked off from the film. But he didn't care. He went ahead and financed the film personally, as he did always. After 1915, 1916, he financed all his own films. And the film was a huge hit. And as a result, he was emboldened by the success of the film that no one believed could be successful. So a year or two after that, he began making speeches advocating for the opening of a second front to aid Russia in their fight against Hitler. A few years before, of course, Russia had been Hitler's ally, but that changed. And Chaplin argued that that was irrelevant, that we had to deal with the situation as it was, and the situation as it was involved Russia as our ally. And the sooner we helped Russia in their fight against Hitler, the sooner the war would be over. This got him in very big trouble in Washington, because at that point in Washington, Hoover was running what had become the FBI, and he had no belief that Russia could be trusted or was interested in anything other than world domination. So as far as he was concerned, Chaplin was giving aid and comfort to our future enemy, if not our current enemy. While all this was going on, Chaplin was involved in a relationship with a young woman named Joan Barry. It lasted about a year. They broke it off. She was extremely unstable, and she went away for a while. She had previously been involved with J. Paul Getty, among others. She went away for a while, came back to Hollywood, and told Chaplin she was pregnant and he was the father. And Chaplin did the math and realized he couldn't have been the father. But she persisted. She went to Hedda Hopper. The story blew the headlines off papers all across the country. He was charged with violating the Mann Act by the government. The Mann Act involved transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. And he was also prosecuted in a paternity suit. He won the Mann Act trial. The jury deliberated for an hour and found him innocent. He took a blood test voluntarily. The blood test proved he was not the father of the child. And he lost the case anyway. And the California courts refused to hear his appeals. So he had to pay child support for a child that wasn't his. It was basically punishment for perceived immorality. And all this on a daily basis of columnists and gossip columnists and newspaper editorials while the war was going on slowly began to turn the American public against him. He was characterized as a libertine, politically unstable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then in 1947, he releases Monsieur Verdoux, a black comedy before black comedy was invented, about a bank teller who goes broke in the Depression and resorts to marrying and murdering rich widows for their money.
Right. This is a movie you barely see anymore.
TCM runs it once in a while. I'm doing an evening on TCM in October when they're showing Modern Times, The Great Dictator, and Monsieur Verdoux in one night. And it was the wrong movie at the wrong time for the wrong audience. Basically, it seemed to act as confirmation of Chaplin's latent misogyny. It was a complete critical and financial flop. His first flop. He'd never had a financial or critical failure before. But Monsieur Verdoux was a financial and critical failure. So that's the long version of what went awry for Charlie Chaplin. And after Monsieur Verdoux, he began to get a lot of pressure from the INS. They began to keep him under daily surveillance. His taxes were audited, both personal and corporate. His house was under surveillance. His phone was bugged. His mail was opened. They treated him like a communist spy, essentially. And they found at the end of the day, after all their investigations, that A, he wasn't a member of the Communist Party, B, had never donated a dime to the cause, and C, was far too independent and solipsistic to belong to any organization with a top-down agenda, because he wouldn't follow anybody else's agenda but his own. Nevertheless, when he left the country, that was their opening to open Limelight in 1952 in England. That gave the government the opening it wanted, and they rescinded his reentry permit. What Chaplin did not know was that about 10 days after the rescinding happened, there was a meeting of the INS in Washington, D.C., and they were talking about the Chaplin matter, and they admitted in the meeting that if he came back and went through bureaucratic channels to get his reentry permit back, they'd have to give it to him because he'd never committed a crime.
Right.
Ever. He'd never been convicted of a crime. So that was the only criteria upon which they could actually rescind his reentry permit, and they didn't have that. So they waited. But what they didn't know was that Chaplin got his back up, and he was livid and enraged and didn't want to belong to any country that didn't want him. So basically what he had to figure out was, what do I do with the rest of my life? And that's part of the story as well.
Right. Wow. You cover in there a lot of things we don't realize about this. One of the things that I found fascinating was that the paternity case I'm an ex-lawyer, so I find those sorts of things interesting. He has a deal, takes a DNA test. They say, you're not the father. And then there is this, I don't know how you would describe it, this lawyer who comes into the question, who's not a DA or anything like that. And now it's like, the heck with the deal we had before, we're going to prosecute you. And this private lawyer prosecutes him for the paternity. When I read that, I keep thinking of, who was it, Frederick March in Inherit the Wind?
I was just going to mention that. The opposing lawyer in the paternity case was a ardent Catholic, and he was deeply morally offended by Chaplin's relationship with a younger woman. Chaplin at this point would have been 52 or 53. The girl was, I believe, 23. Joan Barry was about 23. And today, I find this interesting. Everybody's Facebook feed is salted with pictures of some 20-year-old influencer having a relationship with a 50-year-old actor or a 45-year-old actor, and no one thinks anything of it. And it's not really, I don't think that the culture about older men and younger women has shifted that much. What I think was happening was, this is going to sound funny, Chaplin's first two wives were both underage. They were both 16 years old. And one was pregnant at the time of the marriage. And he had to marry her, basically, or else he would get prosecuted for statutory rape under California law, because 18 was the limit in California law. I believe it still is. You might know more about that than I do. So he did like younger women. But the problem, I think, for Chaplin is that his hair started to go gray in his 30s, and by the time he was 50, it was snow white. So he looked 15 to 20 years older than he actually was. So it wasn't like a normal 50-year-old man involved with a 23-year-old girl. He looked like a 65 or 70-year-old man involved with a 23-year-old girl, which made it seem all the worse. So I think people judged the looks of the situation rather than the, quote, morality, unquote, of the situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was fascinating, and he ended up having to pay child support for this child that wasn't his, and ended up having to pay legal fees, too. That's the other thing that cracked me up. He had to pay the guy's legal fees. Oh,
there was no end. I'm sure his blood pressure must have been shooting up on a regular basis with all these things coming through.
Yeah, because he gets a letter or a bill in the mail saying you owe legal fees to the other guy. Oh, man. That's
right. The guy that pilloried him publicly for 6 weeks on end during the paternity case, yeah.
Now, you mentioned that Charlie was not really involved politically with a lot of these causes. Do you think that's because he was not a U.S. citizen, or just didn't care at all about big causes politically or socially?
No, he didn't. He thought nationalism was insane. He thought nationalism was the basis for Hitler and Nazism. And as he put it, those seeds lie dormant in every country. He loved America. He never would have left otherwise. He had no intention of leaving the country. He had a young wife. He had 4 young children. The last thing he was going to do was uproot his entire life voluntarily. Because, as I said, he was very centered, and he needed that center of gravity. He was not a capricious personality in any way. But it was agonizing for him. It was just agonizing for him. But he adjusted. He took about 3 months to make up his mind where he wanted to live. His brother made a heavy pitch for Switzerland, partially for tax reasons, I'm sure, partially for social reasons, because what he needed after all this chaos was peace and quiet, psychologically. So he ended up buying a manor house, 30-room manor house in Vevey, Switzerland, which is now a Chaplin museum, I might add, and stayed there for the rest of his life. And his kids were all brought up in Switzerland as well.
You make the point, I think, that a lot of people compared him to Charles Dickens. And can you tell everybody how you come to that conclusion and why there is that comparison?
Well, his childhood is out of a Dickens novel. His father died of alcoholism at the age of 37. His father was a music hall entertainer, fairly successful. His mother was also a music hall entertainer, less successful. His mother had periods of instability, which ramped up to insanity, and she had to be institutionalized. Both Charlie and Sidney were also institutionalized because their father was dead and their mother was crazy. So they were put together in a workhouse in the Lambeth area of London, which was enormously humiliating and damaging. And so, in other words, they were cast upon the tender mercies of the Victorian childcare system, about which Charles Dickens wrote most eloquently. And it was ghastly. And even if it hadn't been ghastly, it would have been psychologically ghastly. but it was demeaning. And on the one hand, they taught him how to read and write. As far as we can tell, he didn't really go to any conventional school. He went to school within the institutions where he was remanded to because his mother was in various asylums. And she was in and out for a while. And then after a while, she was back in permanently because she became progressively more damaged. And as we found out years later, she was syphilitic. She had been diagnosed with syphilis at some point, which may or may not have been the proximate cause for her schizophrenia. We'll never know because we don't know at what point she was infected. We know at which point she was diagnosed, but we don't know how long. The diagnostic thing doesn't mention what stage it was at, whether it was secondary or tertiary or what. So we don't know how long she had syphilis.
How old was Charlie at that time? Do you know?
When they were first put in, he was, I believe, 5 or 6. He was 5 or 6. And he was in and out for a period. Occasionally she would get out and they would go to stay with his grandmother. But the grandmother wasn't any much better off than his mother. There was a period of moving around almost month by month to a series of rooms, because they couldn't stay for very long because there was no money coming in. Because his father was dying at this point, then dead. And his father didn't ante up child support in any meaningful way anyway. The courts were after him for back child support. So Sidney went off to an apprenticeship in the Royal Navy when he was, I believe, 13 as a means of learning a career, theoretically, at which point Charlie's on his own. And there was a period in which Charlie lived on the streets because his mother by this time was institutionalized full-time, and he was afraid if he went back to the room where they'd been staying that he would get sent back to the workhouse, which he did not want. He preferred to live on the streets. So, and then Sidney came back from his Navy stint and said, what happened? And he said, well, mother's gone crazy. So at that point, Sidney basically took over the parental role and started taking care of his brother. And it stayed that way. And then Sidney decided, I'm not going to be a sailor. I'm going to go into show business. And Sidney became a comedian with the Fred Carno Company, which was a very successful theatrical troupe that basically was the equivalent of Max Sennett in America. And after Sidney proved to be a success with Carno, he got his kid brother in for a tryout with Carno. And it turned out the kid brother was even more talented, far more talented than Sidney. And Charlie became one of the leading lights of the Fred Carno Company. And from there, he had a successful run in English vaudeville. The troupe came to America for several years, working every big cities, small cities. At one point, they're in Butte, Montana. Other times, they'd be in New York, of course, and Cleveland and Chicago and Los Angeles. And eventually, he was spotted by Max Sennett, who brought him into the movies in December of 1913 at the age of 24. So that was his education in the art of comedy.
Hollywood columnist, big part of what's happened to him. And Hedda Hopper, she didn't like Charlie Chaplin. Did she ever like Charlie Chaplin, or did it turn at one time?
No, so they were never close. They were never close. Hedda was always very conservative, politically conservative, very right-wing. And also she took violent objection to Charlie's relationships with younger women for personal reasons, because she had been the wife of a man named DeWolf Hopper, the young wife of a man named DeWolf Hopper, who was married 5 or 6 times, a noted roue, shall we say. And DeWolf Hopper basically left her stranded with a child, William Hopper, who became Paul Drake on the Perry Mason TV show with Raymond Burr. And as far as she was concerned, anybody who reminded her of her ex-husband was the scum of the earth. And Charlie Chaplin reminded her of DeWolf Hopper, which is not quite the case, but in her mind it was. So, no, she never passed up a chance to slug him in the print.
Okay. And then there was Sullivan. Ed Sullivan didn't like him too much. Same reasons, you think?
Ed Sullivan was Catholic. Ed Sullivan was politically conservative. And also, as the 40s are going on, the blacklist period is beginning. By 1947, when Monsieur Verdoux comes out, the Hollywood 10 are called to testify before Congress. The FBI had subpoenaed the Hollywood 10 because they had the membership rolls of the Communist Party in Los Angeles, so they knew exactly who had been in the party and who hadn't been in the party. And each member of the Hollywood 10 either was currently in the Communist Party or had been in the Communist Party. That's why they called them to testify before Congress. It was a show trial, essentially. And they knew they would be able to get them, if for nothing else, on contempt of Congress. So the blacklist period is picking up momentum, and Chaplin gets caught in the grinding gears of that, just as he's been caught in the grinding gears of the factory in modern times.
He's considered at one point to be not good because he's anti-fascist, and he's not good because they think he's pro-communist, and no matter what the guy can do, he's caught in the middle. Head of Hopper's rival was Luella Parsons. Did she have anything about Chaplin? Was she pro or con on Chaplin?
Luella wrote for Hearst, the Hearst papers, and the Hearst papers were very aggressive regarding Chaplin. Luella was much less aggressive than Hopper was. They weren't friendly exactly, but they were certainly friendlier than Chaplin was with Hopper or Hopper was with Chaplin. So she did not pile on in the same way that Hopper did or that Ed Sullivan did or Westbrook Begler.
People don't realize nowadays the influence that these columnists had on people out there. I mean, they were read voraciously.
Well, each of them had hundreds of papers publishing their columns. Ed Hopper wrote for the Los Angeles Times Syndicate, and Luella wrote for Hearst. And that covered, about 2/3 of the newspapers being published in America.
Just about, yeah. No doubt about it, yep. Now, one of the most important figures as we go on in this book is his wife, Oona. Now, I was unaware of this, and I'm so happy that you included her. Who was Oona Chaplin, and what was her backstory with her father and everything?
Her name was Oona O'Neill. She was the daughter of the playwright Eugene O'Neill, who had a very strange antipathy towards his daughter. He never gave her any credit for any intelligence or any ambition or anything, actually. She was quite beautiful. She looked had the kind of Forrest Sprite thing going on like Audrey Hepburn did. Quite lovely, dark-haired, very Irish, very Gaelic, and sad because she was never part of her father's life and she wanted to be part of her father's life. And she was extremely intelligent. Her letters clearly indicate that. They're delightful. But she never wanted any of her letters published, so none have ever been published. But they're worthy of publication, I can assure you, because she could really write, and she had a delightful sense of humor and very sharp observations about everybody. But O'Neill decisively rejected her when she married Chaplin. She was 18 at the time. Chaplin was 53 or 54. They got married during the Joan Barry case, which, again, seemed to be confirmation of the general public image of Chaplin as a reprobate. It was a great love match. They stayed married for the rest of Chaplin's life. They had 8 kids together. He worshipped her. She worshipped him. And the relationship, I think, made a lot of sense because each of them gave the other one absolute acceptance, which neither of them had, and both of them were looking for. She was looking for the acceptance her father had never given her and a safe harbor that her father had never given her. And he was looking for a woman that didn't have an interest in a career, that would devote herself to his needs and his wants. And she was more than happy to do that. So it was a perfect symbiotic relationship.
It was. And then, Eugene O'Neill took it in his will. He goes even further. His will, it says he wants nothing to do with his daughter. And he went on and on.
He disinherited her.
Yeah.
He disinherited her from his will.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. He was a sweetheart. And the only thing, had she never done anything, really, to enrage him, he was continually pissed off about her. And it's very strange because she'd never actually done anything to embarrass him other than marry Charlie Chaplin.
I've talked to people about the Charlie Chaplin incident upon his death and his burial, and people don't remember it. Could you tell us where he's buried and what happened after he was buried?
He died in 1977. He was 88. He had a series of small strokes, and he was buried in the Verdi Cemetery. And a couple of days after the service, a couple of unemployed laborers dug up the coffin and stole it, basically, and reburied it in an open field dozens of miles away and demanded ransom in return for the coffin. And the family called the Swiss police, and the Swiss police got on the job, and the family kept negotiating with the grave robbers. And while the cops closed in, and finally the cops nabbed him, and they got the coffin back. It had not been opened. So he was reburied, this time in a concrete vault.
Right. Okay. A lot of people didn't remember that. Again, you have written about so many people and have such a knowledge of Hollywood. But what a lot of people don't realize is you've co-written 3 books with Robert Wagner. You just happened to call him up one day and say, do you want to write a book? How does that happen? Did he contact you?
It was the happiest of accidents, the happiest accident of my life next to my marriage. No, what happened was, RJ's a huge reader. He reads all sorts of books, but he also reads books about Hollywood. And he had read my Louis B. Mayer book called Line of Hollywood. And As he told me later, he said, generally when I read a book about people I know, I don't recognize them in the book. He said, but he knew Mayer's daughters, Irene Mayer Selznick and Edie. And he said, I knew them both. And he said, you wrote about them, and that was absolutely the way I saw them in my own life. You know, he said, you captured them. And he'd been idly thinking of maybe I should write a book someday, but he didn't know who to get, and he didn't want to do a conventional, as told to book. He wanted it to be better than that. After he read Line of Hollywood, he thought that my knowledge of the industry would meld well with his knowledge of the industry, and that indeed turned out to be the case. And the first book was a bestseller. The second book was a bestseller, and the third book did very well. So we did 3 books in total.
I'm reading that third book right now about I Love Them in the Movies, and goes decade by decade by decade of all the stars. I didn't realize his first girlfriend was Gloria Swanson's daughter. Friends, if you didn't realize it, Robert Wagner is 93 years old. I thought he was 70. I don't know where those last 20 years got to, but he has a lot of knowledge, and you and he meshed well for those 3 books.
Oh, well, we still mesh well. We go out to see him every summer. He lives in Aspinall with his wife, Jill St. John, and we always go out to visit him every summer. We saw him this year in July and had a lovely week.
Oh, that's wonderful. What's on the horizon for Scott Eyman? What are you going to do? Who's next? Anybody else you're focusing on right now?
I'm not sure, but it's going to be a woman. I need to write about a woman. I've written 7 or 8 books consecutively about men, and I need a break. So I know it's going to be a woman. I just don't know which one.
Don't know which one. But it's going to be back in that black and white era also?
I suspect so. All my books begin from a place of professional admiration. I don't want to spend my time writing about people whose work I don't like or love or respect. So it's got to be someone I have some honest affection for as a professional. And then you try to go beyond that and find out where that gift came from and how it was developed and where the intersection of the personality and the professional was.
Well, there are lots of fascinating women from back at that time period, and I'll tell you, you have your work cut out for you trying to just narrow the field down to one. I mean, I don't know how I could figure out which one would stand out of all those great actresses that are out there, but I'm sure you'll do a wonderful job. I really am. So, well, I really appreciate this, and, friends, we're going to be putting this out, a special episode with this is going to be coming out just before this book is published. It's going to be called, it's Charlie Chaplin versus America, When Art, Sex, and Politics Collide. I love this book. I think you're going to love this book. If you like movies and if you like quality biography, this is the book for you. And I really appreciate you taking your time for me. I really do love that. Maybe next summer when you're out with Robert Wagner, we'll get the 3 of us on and we'll chat about Hollywood. I think that would be a hoot.
That would be fun. That would be fun. Thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you. Friends, we'll be right back after a minute. Well, again, thanks so much, Scott, for coming on Books and Looks and chatting with us about your newest book, Charlie Chaplin versus America. I've read it. It's a wonderful book. I love movies. If you like movies, you want to take a look at this book. If you just like hearing about history, popular history, this is a book for you. Anyway, what am I looking at? Well, I'll tell you what I'm looking at. Holiday time. That's right. I'm looking at holiday time because in a couple days after this is recorded, it's going to be Halloween. But that's not necessarily it. We're looking at all these holidays. That's right, because yesterday our good friends, Bob and Donna came over, and they just bought an artificial tree. Yeah, they're selling the trees, and they're selling for 50% off, so I buy one too. But they're buying their trees already. Stores are gearing up for not just Thanksgiving, for Christmas. We're getting all sorts of stuff. Buy. And, the holidays are upon us. What happened? Just, like 2-3 weeks ago was 90. Now it's down into the 40s at nighttime. I don't know, but holiday season is here. I don't know about you, but I've talked to you in the past about Jóla bókaflóð, about, that Icelandic tradition of giving books, and we're going to work on that. But, what are you doing? Are you going to be giving books for Christmas? What type of books are you going to be giving? What I invite you to do is go back and take a listen to the podcast, or take a look at viewsonbooks.com. All the books that I talk about, I have a review on viewsonbooks.com. Let's say you like history, we got history books for you. That's right. We got Chris Wimmer's book. This book, Charlie Chaplin, that's popular history. We got a lot of history books. We got Mark Piesing, N4 Down, great book. If you like history, you like mysteries, well, we have had a lot of mysteries. If you like novels, we got some great novels. Matter of fact, you got Julia Thomas, with the Radcliffe Ladies Reading Club. You got her husband, Will, Heart of the Nile, if you like mysteries. You got Allie Bryan. Oh, my word, Allie Bryan with the Crow Valley Karaoke, which is one of my favorite books of the year. And, we have all these books for you. If you like, my husband likes sports. Okay. How about Little Poison, about the golfer? Yeah. How about the 2 books, Broken and the First Kentucky Derby? Great books. But I'm not like horses. You know what? They're interesting books. Take a listen. Take a look. Get your fingers, or however you're going to do it, typing or going to your local bookstore. This is your chance to buy some really good books for the family at Christmas time. And that's what I'm going to do. You know me, we're going to read a lot. And nothing new there on our part, but like I said, I'm looking at the holidays because I'm excited. We got Halloween, Thanksgiving. My daughter Sarah's coming home with her boyfriend Ethan. They're going to be here. That's going to be great. And then for Christmas, that's coming up. And the New Year after that. And then holy moly, we're going to be celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the show. Can you imagine that? Oh, my word, oh, word. My word. It's been just so great. Just been so much fun. So anyway, that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the upcoming holiday season because it's upon us, folks. If you haven't realized it, it is upon us. So anyway, on behalf of viewsonbooks.com, on behalf of Podcast Studio X, for Books and Looks, this is Blaine DeSantis saying, may all your leaves be pages in a book.